Rain carved silver lines through Lucas Hayes' headlights as the broken Harley emerged from the darkness ahead. 11:47 p.m. on Interstate 75. The exact stretch where Sarah's life had ended 3 years ago on a night just like this. The motorcycle lay twisted against the guardrail, chrome and black leather gleaming wet under the storm. Steam rose from its engine like ghostly fingers. The woman beside it wasn't moving. Her road angel's jacket splayed open, blood pooling beneath her cracked helmet. Lucas's breath fogged the windshield as his hands locked around the steering wheel. His son's sleeping face flashed through his mind. Innocent, trusting, waiting at home. Every muscle in his body screamed to drive past, to pretend the shadows held nothing but rain and regret. But then her eyes opened, sharp, calculating, fixed directly on him through the glass. His truck pulled to the shoulder before his mind could stop it. When he knelt beside her broken form, she gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "Don't call 911, she whispered, pressing a blood-stained paper into his palm. "Take me here." What Lucas couldn't know was that every drop of blood, every calculated breath, every word had been rehearsed for this exact moment. Lucas stumbled back to his truck, the woman's weight heavier than expected as he helped her into the passenger seat. Her leather jacket creaked with each movement, the road angel's patch catching his dome-light wings spread wide around a silver sword. She moved like someone in pain, but her breathing stayed steady, controlled. Too controlled for someone who'd just been thrown from a motorcycle at highway speed. The address on the blood-stained paper led to an industrial district 15 minutes away, written in surprisingly neat handwriting for someone who'd supposedly just crashed. The woman introduced herself as Raven as they drove through empty streets. No last name, just Raven, like some character from a movie his son would watch on Saturday mornings. She knew things about him that made his skin crawl, where he worked at Miller's auto shop, what grade his boy was in at school, even the name of the neighbor who watched him during night shifts. When he asked how she knew so much about his life, she just smiled and said small towns were like that. Everyone knew everyone. But Riverside had 50,000 people, and Lucas had never seen this woman before tonight. The garage sat at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by chain-link fence and shadows that seemed to move in the wind. An older man emerged from the building before Lucas had even turned off his engine, moving with the kind of confidence that came from expecting visitors. Salt and pepper hair, arms covered in faded tattoos, eyes that had seen too much. He wasn't surprised to see Raven. Wasn't surprised to see the blood on her jacket or the way she favored her left side. He just nodded once and said, "Girl's been practicing her stunts again." Then he looked at Lucas with something that might have been approval. They sat in the garage office drinking coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. Raven moved around the space like she owned it, showing Lucas vintage Harleys with the kind of knowledge that came from years of hands-on experience. She could diagnose engine problems by sound alone, suggested modifications that would have impressed his most experienced mechanics. The older man, she called him Mickey, watched their interaction with keen interest, occasionally dropping comments that felt loaded with meaning. "Raven's got a gift for finding the right people," he said at one point, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate slowness. Raven mentioned losing someone close to her, spoke about children who needed protection without specifying from what. Her voice carried a weight that Lucas recognized, the same grief that had been sitting on his chest for 3 years. She didn't ask about Sarah directly, but somehow conveyed that she understood loss, understood the specific kind of emptiness that came from sudden absence. When she said that sometimes people needed time to accept certain truths, Lucas found himself nodding without knowing why. The coffee grew cold in his hands as he realized this was the first real conversation he'd had with another adult in months. When he finally stood to leave, Raven pressed a small black key into his palm. Not the kind that opened doors or started engines, but something more ornate, like it belonged to an antique jewelry box. "Keep this," she said, her fingers closing around his for just a moment longer than necessary. "You'll know when you need it." The metal felt warm against his skin, worn smooth by countless hands before his. Mickey watched the exchange from behind his coffee cup, and Lucas caught something that looked like satisfaction in the older man's expression. The drive home felt different somehow, like the world had shifted slightly while he wasn't paying attention. Lucas kept glancing at the black key on his dashboard, catching glimpses of numbers etched into its surface. 2019. The year Sarah died. The year his world had collapsed into single parenthood, and sleepless nights and the constant ache of missing someone who would never walk through their front door again. He told himself it was coincidence, that grief made people see patterns where none existed. But his hands shook as he pulled into his driveway, and the key felt heavier than it should have. The next morning brought new problems that pushed mysterious women and strange keys to the back of his mind. His truck wouldn't start, the engine making sounds that spelled expensive repairs he couldn't afford. His boss at Miller's auto shop was understanding but firm. No vehicle meant no job, and no job meant no way to pay for the rent that was already 2 weeks overdue. Lucas sat in his kitchen, staring at past due notices, while his 7-year-old son ate cereal and chatted about a school project he needed help with. The normalcy of it all felt surreal after the previous night's encounter. Raven appeared at the auto shop that afternoon like she'd materialized from thin air. She wore jeans and a simple black t-shirt instead of leather, but the confidence remained unchanged. She offered to fix his truck for free, said she owed him for helping her out. His co-workers gathered around like teenage boys watching a celebrity, making comments about dangerous biker chicks and asking if Lucas knew what he was getting into. Their crude jokes made him uncomfortable, but not as uncomfortable as the way Raven seemed to know exactly what was wrong with his engine before even looking under the hood. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who watched his son during work hours, called that evening with concerns in her voice. A strange woman had come by the school, she said, talked to the boy during recess, asked questions about his family, his routines. The school hadn't been alarmed because the woman claimed to be a family friend, but something about the interaction had bothered his son's teacher. Lucas felt ice form in his stomach as Mrs. Patterson described the woman: young, dark hair, confident manner, riding a motorcycle. When he asked his son about it later, the boy just shrugged and said the nice lady had told him not to worry his dad with their conversation. The confrontation happened the next day in the auto shop parking lot. Lucas found Raven working on his truck engine with professional efficiency, her hands moving with the kind of expertise that came from years of practice. When he demanded an explanation for approaching his son, she didn't deny it or make excuses. Instead, she looked up from the engine bay with oil-stained fingers and said she was trying to prepare the boy for what was coming. Her words sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the October air. What was coming? She wiped her hands on a rag and said he'd understand soon enough. That's when Detective Kane showed up, badge glinting in the afternoon sunlight as he approached with the measured gait of someone who'd delivered bad news too many times. Kane had investigated Sarah's accident 3 years ago, had been the one to sit in Lucas's living room and explain that sometimes bad things just happened to good people. Now he wanted to know about Raven, about the Road Angels Motorcycle Club, about activities that might be connected to unsolved cases in the area. Lucas felt like he was drowning in implications he didn't understand, caught between a woman who knew too much and a cop who was asking the wrong questions. Kane's warning was simple but chilling. "The Road Angels weren't just another motorcycle club," he said. "They had connections to events that law enforcement was still trying to piece together, including incidents that might be related to Sarah's death." Lucas wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, but the detective's expression was too serious, too concerned. When Kane mentioned that Sarah's accident had been closed too quickly, that there might have been details overlooked in the initial investigation, Lucas felt the ground shift beneath his feet once again. 3 years of grief suddenly felt like 3 years of lies. The evidence appeared gradually, like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known he was supposed to solve. A woman's jacket in Mickey's garage that looked exactly like one Sarah used to wear. His son drawing pictures of a sister in black leather who looked suspiciously like Raven. The way Raven sometimes moved her hands when she talked, gestures that reminded him painfully of his wife. The black key with its meaningful date, sitting on his kitchen counter like an accusation. Each detail felt insignificant on its own, but together they formed a pattern that made his chest tight with possibility and terror. Raven's explanation came during a quiet moment in the garage, rain drumming on the metal roof while she showed him how to rebuild a carburetor. She and Sarah had been friends, she said, part of a community of people who understood the freedom that came with 2 wheels and an open road. She'd come to Riverside to fulfill a promise made to someone who couldn't make good on it herself. When Lucas pressed for details, Raven's eyes grew distant, and she said some promises took time to keep properly. Her words felt like riddles, designed to reveal just enough truth to be frustrating. The photograph changed everything. Lucas found it tucked inside a toolbox in Mickey's garage, a candid shot of Sarah and Raven standing beside a Harley-Davidson. But the woman in the picture looked younger than the Raven he knew, her face softer, less marked by whatever experiences had hardened her features. The timestamp showed it was taken 5 years ago, 2 years before Sarah's death. When he confronted Raven about it, she studied the image for a long moment before admitting that she wasn't just Sarah's friend. She was her sister, her younger sister, who'd spent the last 3 years living with a secret that had nearly destroyed her. Mickey's comment about plans that took 3 years to complete suddenly made terrible sense. Detective Kane's investigation into the Road Angels took on new significance. The way Raven knew so much about his life, about his son, about the routines and habits that defined their small world. Even her presence at the crash site began to feel less like coincidence and more like careful orchestration. Lucas realized he'd been walking through someone else's design for weeks, making choices that felt like his own, but led exactly where they were supposed to lead. The trust he'd built with Raven crumbled and reformed in the space of a heartbeat. If she was Sarah's sister, why hadn't she come forward 3 years ago? Why the elaborate deception with the fake accident and the careful manipulation? What kind of promise required so much secrecy, so much pain? When he asked these questions, Raven's composure finally cracked. She turned away from him, shoulders shaking with emotion she'd kept carefully controlled until that moment. "Because," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain on the roof, "some truths are too dangerous to tell until you're sure the person hearing them can handle what comes next." His son's disappearance hit like a physical blow. One moment the boy was walking out of school with his usual aftercare group, the next he was simply gone. Mrs. Patterson's frantic phone call came during Lucas's shift at the auto shop, and he dropped everything to race across town. The school officials were apologetic, but unhelpful. A woman matching Raven's description had signed the boy out using proper identification and paperwork that seemed legitimate. Security cameras showed his son leaving willingly, even holding the woman's hand as they walked to a waiting motorcycle. Detective Kane's voice over the phone was carefully controlled, but Lucas could hear the tension underneath. "They'd found the boy," Kane said. "He was safe, unharmed, at the old warehouse on the outskirts of town. But Lucas shouldn't come alone, and he definitely shouldn't trust anything he was about to see or hear." The drive to the warehouse felt endless. Every red light and stop sign another moment his son spent in the hands of people whose motivations remained frustratingly unclear. The black key sat heavy in his pocket, its significance still a mystery, but its weight somehow comforting. The warehouse looked abandoned from the outside, but Lucas could see light seeping through dirty windows and hear the low rumble of motorcycle engines from within. The road angels had gathered in force, 15 or 20 bikes arranged in a precise semicircle around the building's main entrance. Detective Kane met him in the parking lot, badge visible but weapon holstered, looking more like someone attending a planned meeting than responding to a kidnapping. When Lucas demanded to know what was happening, Kane just shook his head and said it was time for the truth. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed into something between a clubhouse and a courtroom. His son sat cross-legged on a workbench, completely unharmed and drinking chocolate milk like this was the most normal thing in the world. Mickey stood nearby, still radiating that calm authority Lucas had noticed during their first meeting. Raven waited in the center of the space, no longer playing the role of mysterious stranger, but standing with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The road angels surrounded them all, silent witnesses to whatever revelation was about to unfold. Detective Kane spoke first, his words cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. He wasn't investigating the road angels, he explained. He was working with them, had been for months as part of an undercover operation targeting a different group entirely. The Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club had been using interstate highways for drug trafficking, and they'd targeted Sarah 3 years ago when she'd refused to carry their packages. What Lucas had thought was a random accident had actually been attempted murder, and the only reason his wife wasn't dead was because the road angels had intervened. Raven's revelation hit harder than Detective Kane's confession. She wasn't just Sarah's sister. She was her younger sister by 5 years. The woman in the old photograph had been 21, full of dreams and reckless courage. The woman standing before him now was 26, shaped by 3 years of carrying an impossible secret. She'd been with Sarah the night of the accident, riding behind her when the Iron Wolves forced them off the road. She'd watched her sister's bike tumble into the guardrail, had seen the blood and the twisted metal and the paramedics who arrived too late. But Sarah hadn't died that night. She'd been badly injured, suffered severe head trauma that left her with no memory of her previous life. The road angels had made a choice in that moment, a choice that haunted Raven every day since. Rather than let the Iron Wolves know their intimidation had failed, they'd let the world believe Sarah was dead. They'd taken her to a safe house, provided medical care, waited for her memory to return. For 2.5 years, Sarah had been a ghost living among strangers who told her stories about the life she couldn't remember. The final twist came when Raven led him to a small room at the back of the warehouse. Sarah sat on a folding chair, wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, and a hairstyle that was nothing like he remembered. She looked older, marked by experiences he couldn't imagine, but her eyes were still the same eyes that had watched him promise to love her forever 8 years ago. She looked up when he entered, and the smile that crossed her face was hesitant but unmistakably real. "Hello, Lucas," she said, and her voice carried 3 years of longing. "I'm sorry it took so long to come home." The explanation came in fragments, interrupted by tears and disbelief and the overwhelming need to touch someone he'd thought was lost forever. Sarah's memory had returned gradually over 6 months, starting with flashes of faces and voices that meant nothing to her damaged brain. 6 months ago, she'd remembered Raven's name. 4 months ago, she'd remembered their son's laugh. 2 months ago, the pieces had finally assembled into something resembling her former life. But the memory came with knowledge of the danger that had never disappeared. The iron wolves were still out there, still trafficking drugs along the interstate highways, still willing to kill anyone who threatened their operation. Sarah's return from the dead would have exposed the road angels' involvement, put everyone she cared about in immediate danger. So she'd asked Raven to test him, to see if 3 years of single parenthood had changed him, if he was still the man she'd married, if he could handle the truth about what their life would become. The fake accident had been Raven's idea, a way to approach him naturally, to evaluate his character without revealing the stakes. Detective Kane's presence made sense now. The Iron Wolves had recently discovered that Sarah might still be alive, were asking questions and making threats that suggested they intended to finish what they'd started 3 years ago. Kane's investigation had been building toward this moment, toward a confrontation that would either end the threat permanently or force Sarah back into hiding forever. Lucas looked around the warehouse, at the assembled road angels, at his son playing contentedly nearby, and realized he was being asked to choose not just Sarah's future, but the kind of life he wanted for his family. The decision should have been impossible, but it felt surprisingly clear. Lucas had spent 3 years learning to be brave in small ways, working night shifts to pay rent, helping his son with homework he didn't understand, facing each day without the person who'd made everything make sense. Now he was being asked to be brave in a way that mattered beyond their small world, to stand up to people who used fear as a weapon, to trust that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible to win. The Iron Wolves arrived sooner than anyone expected, roaring into the warehouse district with the kind of noise that was meant to intimidate. Lucas stood with the road angels, holding his son's hand while Sarah gripped his other arm with fingers that shook slightly. Detective Kane coordinated with backup units through a radio that crackled with tension, and Mickey distributed instructions with the calm efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. Lucas had never been in a fight more serious than playground disagreements, but he understood that running wasn't an option anymore. The confrontation lasted 12 minutes from start to finish, though it felt like hours in the living. Federal agents emerged from unmarked vehicles, catching the Iron Wolves in a coordinated trap that had been months in the making. The road angels had been cooperating with law enforcement all along, providing information and evidence that would dismantle a trafficking network spanning multiple states. Lucas watched from inside the warehouse as handcuffs clicked and Miranda rights were read, as the threat that had shaped 3 years of his life was finally neutralized by people who understood justice better than he'd given them credit for. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of readjustment and discovery. Sarah moved back into their house, but she slept in the guest room at first, unsure how to navigate a life she remembered but had never fully lived. She'd changed during her time away. Grown more independent, more decisive, marked by experiences that belonged to someone else's story. Lucas found himself falling in love with a familiar stranger, learning her new habits while mourning the loss of old ones that would never return. Their son adapted with the resilience of childhood, accepting his mother's return as just another adventure in a life full of them. He taught her how to make his favorite breakfast, showed her the games he'd learned while she was away, introduced her to friends she'd never met. Sometimes Lucas caught him staring at Sarah with a thoughtful expression, as if he was trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the mother who existed only in photographs and gradually fading memories. Raven visited often during those first weeks, helping Sarah navigate the practical details of resurrection updating identification, explaining gaps in employment history, rebuilding connections with people who'd thought she was dead. The sisters spent hours in quiet conversation, repairing a relationship that had been frozen in time and trauma. Lucas watched them together and understood that Raven had sacrificed more than anyone realized, had given up 3 years of her own life to preserve something she'd never been sure she could restore. The garage became a second home for all of them, a place where their unusual family could exist without explanation or judgment. Mickey treated Lucas's son like a beloved grandson, teaching him to identify engine problems by sound and showing him how to handle tools with proper respect. Sarah learned to ride again under Raven's patient instruction, rebuilding confidence that had been shattered along with her memory. Lucas found himself part of a community he'd never expected to join, accepted by people whose loyalty ran deeper than blood. Detective Kane stopped by occasionally, ostensibly to check on their adjustment, but really to satisfy himself that the choices they'd all made had been worth the cost. The Iron Wolves prosecution was proceeding smoothly, he reported, with convictions likely for everyone involved in Sarah's attack. The Road Angels were being recognized for their cooperation, their willingness to risk exposure in service of something larger than themselves. Justice, Kane said, sometimes took longer than anyone wanted, but it usually found its way to the right destination. 6 months after Sarah's return, they established new routines that honored both who they'd been and who they were becoming. Sunday mornings at Mickey's garage, working on projects that had no deadline beyond the satisfaction of completion. Wednesday evenings, teaching their son to ride his bike while Sarah cheered from the sidelines, her voice carrying across the neighborhood like music. Saturday afternoons, driving familiar roads with unfamiliar passengers, learning to see their small town through eyes that had been elsewhere and chosen to come home. The black key finally revealed its purpose when Sarah led them to a storage unit on the other side of town. Inside, carefully preserved in climate-controlled darkness, were the remnants of their previous life photo albums, keepsakes, letters she'd written during her recovery but never sent. Also waiting was a college fund for their son, money saved from her previous job, and carefully invested by people who'd believed in futures even when the present seemed hopeless. Lucas held his wife's hand as they sorted through artifacts of a life that felt both distant and immediate, both lost and miraculously recovered. The house changed gradually, accumulating new memories while preserving space for old ones. Sarah's motorcycle sat in the garage beside Lucas's truck, chrome and leather waiting for weekend adventures they were still learning to plan together. Their son's artwork covered the refrigerator with images of families that included everyone who mattered. Parents, aunt, honorary grandfather, even Detective Kane making an occasional appearance. The drawing suggested a worldview that was broader than Lucas had managed to provide alone, richer for including people whose love came without biological obligation. Some evenings they sat on the front porch and watched their neighbors live their ordinary lives. Walking dogs, mowing lawns, calling children in for dinner. The normalcy felt precious after so much uncertainty, but it also felt fragile, like something that required daily maintenance to preserve. Sarah sometimes mentioned the places she'd been during her absence, the people who'd cared for her when she couldn't care for herself, the debt of gratitude that could never be fully repaid. Lucas understood that their happiness was built on foundations laid by strangers who'd risked everything for people they barely knew. The road angels remained part of their extended family, visiting for birthdays and holidays, and the occasional evening when adult conversation felt necessary for mental health. Raven moved to another state eventually, following opportunities that took her away from the memories embedded in every street and building. But she sent postcards regularly, documenting adventures that sounded both thrilling and lonely, reminding them that some people's calling involved motion, while others found purpose in staying still. Their son wrote school essays about heroes that featured his aunt prominently, describing someone who'd taught his father that scary-looking people sometimes had the biggest hearts. Lucas read these assignments with mixed emotions, proud of his boy's insight, but aware that the lessons came with complications most children never faced. When teachers asked about the unusual cast of characters in their family stories, Lucas learned to explain that sometimes families were assembled rather than inherited, built through choice rather than chance. The final truth settled over them slowly, like dust accumulating on surfaces that weren't regularly cleaned. They were different people than they'd been 3 years ago, shaped by experiences that had tested every assumption about love and loyalty and the prices people paid for both. Lucas was stronger, more decisive, marked by the confidence that came from surviving tests he'd never expected to face. Sarah was more independent, more aware of her own strength, grateful for ordinary days in ways that broke his heart. Their son was more adaptable, more inclusive, blessed with a broader definition of family than most children his age could comprehend. On quiet Sunday mornings, when rain drummed against their windows and the world felt safely contained within their small house, Lucas sometimes remembered the night he'd found a broken motorcycle on Interstate 75. He thought about the choice he'd made to stop, to help, to trust someone whose motives remained unclear until the very end. The decision had felt spontaneous at the time, driven by instincts he couldn't explain, but he understood now that some choices were prepared for long before the moment they were required. Sarah curled against him on those peaceful mornings, her breathing steady and warm against his chest, and he marveled at the intricate conspiracy that had been required to bring her home. The fake accident, the careful manipulation, the months of planning by people who owed them nothing but had given them everything. Raven's sacrifice, Mickey's patience, Detective Kane's professional courage, even the Iron Wolf's greed, all of it had been necessary to create the exact circumstances that allowed love to triumph over fear, family to overcome separation, truth to finally emerge from the shadows where it had been carefully protected. Their story could have ended differently so many times, derailed by 1,000 small choices that might have led in other directions. If Lucas had driven past that night, if Raven had been less careful in her approach, if Sarah's memory had never returned, if the Iron Wolves had been more persistent or law enforcement less thorough, but instead their story had led them here, to Sunday mornings and ordinary happiness, and the profound satisfaction of a life reassembled with help from people whose love came without conditions or expectations of return. The scar on Sarah's temple caught the morning light as she shifted in her sleep, a permanent reminder of the night their old life ended, and this new one began its long journey toward existence. Lucas traced the mark with gentle fingers, thinking about healing and time and the unexpected ways people found their way back to each other. Outside their window, Riverside was waking up to another ordinary day, filled with ordinary families living ordinary lives. Inside their house, an extraordinary family that had been built through patience and sacrifice, and the stubborn refusal to accept that some losses were permanent, was beginning another ordinary day of their own, grateful for the gift of normal and the people who'd made it possible.